The Huskies win on Saturday, the Seahawks win on Monday, and the Sounders win on Tuesday. A great weekend for Seattle sports teams. Let's take it around the sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the Sound. Today is episode 23. We have 3 games to talk about, 3 games that happened this weekend, extended weekend. We had the Seahawks on Monday, the Sounders on Tuesday. It felt like a little bit of a weekend for at least me, but we had 3 games, 3 wins. We'll get to all 3 of them, but before that, I want to make sure all of you are following me on Twitter at the Peyton Thomas and following the podcast on Instagram at Around the Sound Seattle. We post every time on that Instagram account when there is a new episode of Around the Sound. Of course, we have new episodes of Around the Sound every Wednesday and Saturday around here. You can watch every episode of Around the Sound on YouTube at PTOM Media. That's PTHOM space media. Again, this is an audio-only episode. Just like last week, we're away from the studio now. A few more weeks of this, then we'll be back in the studio, so our YouTube watchers will have that video portion of Around the Sound. But for those of you that are listening to the podcast, you can get Around the Sound wherever you get your podcast. Let's hop into the first victory we saw on Saturday, which was an incredible comeback win for the Huskies against Utah. This game was supposed to be the Apple Cup, if you remember, the day after Thanksgiving. That's traditionally when it's been played. Due to 2020, due to COVID, the Cougars did not have enough players to play the game. Utah was also supposed to play Arizona State this weekend. Arizona State could not play due to the amount of players that were in the contact tracing COVID-19 threshold. The Pac-12 has really strict rules. If teams seem to get it, any trace of COVID-19 in their locker rooms, it seems like with the contact tracing and the amount of players that it links back to, that team will not be able to play the game that weekend. Both WSU and ASU cannot play their games. Washington and Utah, a match made in heaven for the weekend in order for the 2 healthy teams, the teams that have enough players to be able to play this game. And Utah exposed this front 7, this Huskies front 7 in the first half. It was similar to the Oregon State game, except Utah was also doing it on the defensive side of the ball. If you recall back to the Oregon State game against UW earlier in the season, that game was really close, really tight. The reason that Washington was able to squeak by Oregon State was because the Oregon State's defense didn't really show up in the first half. Well, they did show up, but the Huskies were able to put some points on the board. This game was 21-0 or 24-0 at halftime, Utah being up, and Utah was just able to run the ball essentially the whole first half as they pleased. They were picking up 5.6 yards per carry. Normally about 4 yards is the threshold of whether you're stopping the run effectively or not. If you're under that 4-yard marker, if you're holding your opponent to less than 4 yards per carry, you're doing an okay job containing the run. If you're more than 4, normally the opponent is getting enough yards that they can pick up consistent first downs by just using the running game. They don't have to resort to a passing attack. Utah was gaining 5.6 yards per carry on the ground. That's a lot. That means that the front 7 is getting beat. Utah's running the ball. They don't have to rely on their quarterback to make big plays to get them out of long third down situations. That means that Utah is grinding the clock, they're grinding the ball, and they're moving their way downfield slowly, but surely 5.6 yards, and eventually ending it with at least a field goal, if not a touchdown, which was most of the case in the first half. 2 first-half interceptions for Dylan Morris as well. He picked up a 3rd interception in the second half, but for the first 2 in the first half, the Huskies went down. He was forced to throw the ball. Jimmy Lake had to open the playbook. He was forced to open the playbook and rely on his freshman quarterback, his young wide receivers a little bit more. And when the pressure started to ramp up for Dylan Morris in that first half, he just looked a little bit nervy. It looked like the Huskies as a whole didn't have the firepower to return and come back from that deficit, especially after that second Morris interception right before the half. Utah almost ran that back for a pick 6, which would have made the deficit almost insurmountable. But that second interception, Morris forced to throw the ball, a little bit of trouble in the first half, but we'll talk about how he kind of regained the pieces and got it back together for the second half. Going into halftime, it was 21-0. Dylan Morris did throw his second interception on what was sort of a Hail Mary play right before time expired. Utah almost returned it. 21-0. Jimmy Lake's got a freshman quarterback. You have a new coach, a new system, and that halftime talk must have been great because both sides of the ball really never looked back once they left the halftime locker room. The defense didn't give up any more points in the whole entirety of the second half. The offense came right back out onto the field in the third quarter and marched down the field for their opening drive and got their first points on the board. Morris gained more poise throughout the second half, and despite that third interception, that little blip, the whole Huskies offense looked really cohesive and flipped the script on what this game was in the first half. It looked like the Huskies were down and out, especially like I mentioned, with all those first-year players, with a system that they're not yet confident in. I'm sure the team is confident in their system, but I don't know if Jimmy Lake is confident in his freshman quarterback. Jimmy Lake, being a head coach, has not proven his ability to stay in games. This game was 21-0 at half, looking really rough. Utah running all over the front seven. You have a freshman quarterback. It's really easy to just abandon the system in this game, throw in your second stringers, and kind of bow out of this one in the second half. Tremendous credit for Jimmy Lake to keeping his guys' heads in it. At that point, it becomes a little bit about Utah not getting complacent, being up that many points, and Jimmy Lake keeping his guys focused, keeping the belief that they can score, they can get back in this game, they can make something happen with what they have. Lake did not pull Dylan Morris, and in the post-game press conference, he had kind of alluded to the fact that he was never going to pull Morris. He never had the idea, it never popped into his head that he was going to rely on his backup quarterbacks. And remember, the Huskies have kind of a loaded quarterback room. Before the season started, we didn't know who was going to line up under center for this Huskies team. There were 4 guys all fighting for that spot. There were some guys like Kevin Thompson who had a lot more experience. But Jimmy Lake goes with the freshman. He goes with Dylan Morris, the kid out of Puyallup, local kid, and he's trying to grow this prospect into and grow this program as a whole back to where they were in 2016, 17, 18, where they had that great run in the Pac-12 conference, only losing 5 games in 3 years in conference play. Morris did have some bad moments, though. There are definitely places for him to grow. There was parts of this game where he looked like one of the worst quarterbacks in the Pac-12. There were also moments where he looked like one of the best quarterbacks in the Pac-12. That game-winning drive, I want to call it a game-winning drive, Utah had the chance to kind of counter-punch late in the game before an interception sealed it. But with four and change left to go in the game, Dylan Morris gets the ball on his own 12-yard line, has to go 88 yards, needs a big drive from this offense. Jimmy Lake put the ball in his hands. The play calling was aggressive. It was necessary. Some good throws were made. There weren't important drops made by his receivers, which means that Dylan Morris is developing chemistry with his receivers. And that drive was the final punch that the Huskies needed in the second half to come back. Before that drive, they were down still 4 points. After that drive, getting a touchdown, that put them up 24-21, which is how the game ended. Really important clutch drive. A lot of poise, a lot of responsibility put both on the coach, the staff, and the quarterback. Really, really impressive from everybody that's involved to pull off that kind of comeback against a Utah team who had looked so great in the first half. Really, really impressive. Let's talk about the defensive side of the ball, because in the second half, they really turned it on as well, conceding 21 points, 3 touchdowns in the first half, and 5.6 yards per carry on the ground. In the second half, 0 points allowed. Utah went into the halftime locker room with 21 points. They came out of the game with 21 points. Zion Tupola Fetui, I think that's how you pronounce his name. I'm going to call him ZTF. He's been amazing. In the Husky preview that I did a few weeks ago with Damon Heward, go back and watch that if you haven't seen it already. I said that there were a lot of prospects on this defense, and in the past few years, the Huskies have had several first-round picks come out of that Chris Peterson recruiting class and those recruiting pools. And I was looking for the next guy to step up for that Huskies defense, the next guy that looks like he could play on Sundays, play in the NFL, and ZTF looks like one of those guys. He's built like a Von Miller or Khalil Mack. He's not quite that big, but he's a guy that's an outside linebacker who can drop into pass coverage, so you can use him both ways. He's mainly a pass rusher that gets to the quarterback, stops the run, and is in the defensive backfield all day, but he can also drop back into pass coverage if the Huskies need him to do that. But everything on the score sheet, all of the big plays he's made has been sacking the quarterback, forced fumbles out of the quarterback's hands, stopping the run for tackles for loss. He's been all over the defensive score sheet, leading the team in tackles, I believe, right now, and tackles for loss, forced fumbles. He's been doing it all. He really showed up in this game against Utah, but if you look back, you watch the film, you look at the numbers, the defensive numbers for ZTF, been really, really impressive so far this year, especially when that defense been missing those guys like Joe Tryon, other opt-outs on that front seven. First half wasn't so hot from everybody on that line. ZTF stepped up in the second half. The whole defense stepped up in the second half. Part of the comeback, a necessary part of the comeback. The offense would not have been able to do it without that really strong defensive showing from the defense. The Huskies are now the only Pac-12 team, in my opinion, with a shot at the playoff. If you look at the AP poll, the Huskies are finally ranked. USC is the top Pac-12 team at 17. They're still undefeated, but have had some COVID problems. Oregon, after that loss from Oregon State, have dropped to 21 in the AP poll. The Huskies, 3-0, now rise to number 23 in the AP poll. But this is the reason that I say that the Huskies are the only Pac-12 team with a shot at the playoff. USC can't do any better than 6-0. They've had COVID problems, they've had games canceled, and they won't play any ranked opponents until that Pac-12 championship game. They'll most likely play a ranked opponent who only has 1 loss or 0 losses in the Pac-12 championship game. But it's really tough to believe that even if they win out, they deserve that spot because they had not played anybody in the regular season. And that's not really on USC. That's not really their fault. But unfortunately for them, because of COVID, they missed out on one of their biggest opponents in the regular season. And they just didn't have that tough of a schedule in the Pac-12 South with this shortened season. Oregon is essentially out now with their loss to Oregon State. In order for a Pac-12 team to make it in general at the beginning of the year, you had to see a Pac-12 not just go undefeated throughout the whole season, but dominate some of the other big teams in the conference. With that loss against Oregon State, it's really difficult to see Oregon, even if they blow everybody out, they blow Washington out in the last week of normal Pac-12 play, they blow out whoever they play in the Pac-12 South in the Pac-12 championship game. It's really tough to see an Oregon team with 1 loss have an argument for the playoffs. Now, I want to say, this is a huge, huge long shot, but if any team were to still have a shot at the college football playoff, it's probably Washington. Now, what would it take? It would take, obviously, no losses, no blips along the way. Otherwise, you would be in a worse position than Oregon is right now, who is already essentially eliminated from the college football playoff. Everything has to go perfectly. You would have to win the Oregon game really, really convincingly. You would have to go into that Pac-12 championship and play a USC team that is also undefeated because you want that strength of victory. The College Football Playoff Committee looks at strength of victory. They look at strength of opponent. You would have to play that 6-0 USC team in the Pac-12 championship. You would also, more difficultly, and this is obviously easier said than done, but you would have to win convincingly against that impressive 6-0 USC team. Everything must go perfectly. This is another argument, or alluding to an argument about should the college football playoff extend to an 8-team playoff, which we touched on in the Huskies season preview that I mentioned earlier in the episode. That's a conversation for another day. UW has Stanford at home this weekend on Saturday. Have to get past this one before you get to the Oregon game. Still a huge, huge long shot, but the college football playoff as a whole doesn't look like it will have a Pac-12 team for the second straight year. All right, that was the first win that we saw of the weekend on Saturday. Let's move on to Monday Night Football, the NFL, the Seahawks. And the key to the victory for the Seahawks on Monday night, 23-17 over the Eagles, was 2 Ds. There were 2 Ds in that victory. There was the defense, and then there was DK. Let's talk about the defense first. I want to prelude this by saying, yes, it was the Eagles, who have a Carson Wentz that we talked about on Around the Sound, who has not been the same quarterback that was the 2017 Carson Wentz that was lighting up the league. This is the quarterback that has the most turnovers in the NFL right now. Carson Wentz, who has been the most sacked quarterback in the NFL right now. But this defense, this Seahawks defense, also isn't the same as the past terrible defense that was really on pace to set the record for most passing yards allowed in the history of the NFL. They were on that record-breaking pace. Really has looked impressive in these past 2 games. Think back to last week, Thursday Night Football, Seahawks versus Cardinals, a 28-21 victory there, which was led by the defense. It was a Pete Carroll-style victory against the Cardinals. This game against the Eagles, 23-17, another Pete Carroll-style victory. This game could have easily looked a lot uglier than it really did. The Eagles picked up their last touchdown on a Hail Mary pass at the end of the game. Had it not been that, the game would not have finished 23-17. It would have looked a lot uglier for the Eagles and a lot better for the Seahawks defense. The Eagles did not have a single first down for most of that first half. I remember looking over and looking at the stats on my phone in the middle of the second quarter and thinking to myself, have the Eagles had a first down yet? I feel like it's been all 3 and outs. And I looked at my phone, looked at the stats, and 0 first downs for the Eagles. The Seahawks at that time had, I think, double-digit first downs. But really impressive stuff from the defense to come out firing and maintain that impressive control over the game for the remainder of the game. Talk about the front seven, the defensive line and the linebackers. They got 6 sacks against Carson Wentz, who I just mentioned, the most sacked QB in the NFL. Carson Wentz has had significant offensive line problems. He's had 3 of his most experienced offensive linemen out with significant injuries this year. The Eagles couldn't ever really establish the run, which forced Wentz to try to make important plays, and that certainly contributed to those sack numbers. But the reason that they couldn't establish the run was also because of the great run-stopping ability from the Seahawks front seven. Carlos Dunlap, Damon Snacks Harrison, Bobby Wagner, all of those guys getting a few tackles this game in order to stop Miles Sanders and that Eagles run game from ever really getting going. The linebackers, KJ Wright, Bobby Wagner, both were impressive in pass breakups. Earlier in the season, we saw both Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright essentially outrun by tight ends and wide receivers to go for big gains. Bobby had one great pass breakup down the field. He had to chase, I think it was Dallas Goedert, down the field and made a great pass breakup, got his hand in there and broke up the pass play. KJ had 1 or 2 pass breakups up toward the line of scrimmage. Carson Wentz just didn't see him. KJ Wright had one that was near the end of the game that kind of sealed the victory for the Seahawks. But as far as the secondary never looked scared. We heard from Jamal Adams that he's getting healthier. We certainly saw more energy out of him this game. Quentin Dunbar, Trey Flowers, Shaquille Griffin, everybody's back in the secondary from the Seahawks. They kept everything in front of them. They played some of that cloud coverage. They weren't put in significantly dangerous situations because the defensive line was getting penetration and hitting Carson Wentz significantly, frequently, I should say, throughout the course of the game. But the secondary, really solid, kept everything in front of them, kept Carson Wentz or any of those Eagles receivers from having a good day. The Jets come to play in Seattle in 2 weeks, and I can't wait to see that Jamal Adams revenge game. If he stays healthy, we're seeing Jamal Adams get better. We talked about it on Around the Sound earlier this week that Jamal Adams is going to continue to get better. What is Jamal Adams' ceiling? He picked up a couple more sacks this game, a couple more tackles, and I want to see Jamal Adams fired up, that energy the whole game against the Jets, because you've heard it in Jamal Adams' press conferences all year, just how much he hates the Jets and just how glad he is to be out of that dysfunctional organization. It was the greatest thing that happened to him in his entire life, is that he got to leave New York and got to leave the Jets organization. It's absolutely hilarious to see Jamal just kind of crap on the Jets and look back at this pile of crap that's in this franchise that are now 0-11. I do want to say the Jets are well on their way to having the first seed and an 0-16 season. They would be the third 0-16 NFL team in history to join the 2008 Detroit Lions and the 2016 Cleveland Browns. If the Jets do it, a historical 0-16 season for the Jets of incompetence. But Jamal Adams, of course, glad that he left that crapshoot over there in New York. He's now with the Seahawks, who are 8-3. I'm really looking forward to that revenge game. Both of the Seahawks' next 2 opponents are the New York teams. You have the Giants at home, followed by the Jets at home, in this cakewalk, easier part of the Seahawks schedule, where pretty much everybody expects Russell Wilson and the Seahawks to gain traction, continue to win, and charge for that first seed in the NFC West. All right, let's talk about the second D, which was DK Metcalf. Apparently, the Eagles' defensive coordinator came up to DK before the game and said, "Hey man, I was in Detroit, you're not Megatron." Now, I don't think that's exactly how the Eagles' defensive coordinator meant to say it to DK. I think he was trying to say it as a compliment. At least that's what he said after the game in a press conference, that, no, I was complimenting DK. I was saying he's the closest thing to Megatron, and he was this great receiver. Well, unfortunately for the Eagles' defensive coordinator, he lit a fire under DK Metcalf. And you do not want to light a fire under DK Metcalf. You don't want to put a chip on his shoulder. That's like lighting a fire under MJ in The Last Dance. You don't do it. You'll get burned if you try to do that. And DK Metcalf burned them. He had 10 catches, 177 yards. That topped his all-time high for receiving yards in a single game. Topped his previous high against the 49ers earlier this year. And a funny narrative that's come out of this game, the Philadelphia Eagles drafted J.J. Arcega-Whiteside just a few picks, seven or so picks, before DK Metcalf was drafted by the Seattle Seahawks. And DK certainly has a chip or a vendetta against the Eagles for not picking him, and want to prove them wrong and want to go off against the Eagles every single game. And I want to know, Arcega-Whiteside has not been very good for the Eagles since he's joined. He's only had about 12 catches for the Eagles in 23 games since he was drafted. Of course, DK, the polar opposite, who now tops the NFL in receiving yards for 2020. But DK got in the Eagles' heads, got in the Eagles' defense's heads right on the first drive. On the first drive, there were 2 unsportsmanlike conduct penalties from players that were shoving DK after the play. And the Eagles' defense, the reason the Seahawks were able to move down the field so easily was essentially because DK kept getting in their heads. Darius Slay got absolutely torched. He was trying to play physical with DK Metcalf, and DK Metcalf just bullied Darius Slay all game. Darius Slay was a Pro Bowler last year who played great defense, great in the secondary for Detroit all those years, now moves to Philadelphia, who's been really solid. But he made that Pro Bowler look like a rookie all game. In the press conference after the game, Darius Slay was asked whether the Eagles defense should have schemed to help him more against DK Metcalf. Darius Slay shoved off the question, says, "I don't need any help. Don't talk to me like that. I can cover him." And he clearly needed help because DK Metcalf was open all game, bullying him, shoving him to the side. But really, really impressive performance from DK going up against yet another Pro Bowl receiver. I will say DK Metcalf is probably 2-1 now against Pro Bowl receivers in 2020. He now has this great game against Darius Slay. It made him look like a rookie. He had the great game in week 2 against the Patriots and Stephon Gilmore, the Pro Bowl corner, one of the best corners in the NFL. But he does have sort of that loss looming over his head that he had against Jalen Ramsey in the Rams game. Part of that could have been Russell Wilson, who was off that day and wasn't really getting DK Metcalf the ball. But I'm sure DK will have that chip on his shoulder, have that fire under him when the Seahawks play the Rams on Week 17. That'll be an important game. That game could potentially decide the division, the NFC West, and DK will be ready for that game. I'm sure he will want to get back at Jalen Ramsey, another Pro Bowl corner, one of the best to do it in the NFL right now. Outside of Metcalf, the offense was efficient. It wasn't lighting the world on fire. Russ was efficient. He didn't really turn the ball over. Only 1 touchdown on the night, a high completion percentage for Russ. Chris Carson was back and had a great tough running touchdown, a really impressive Marshawn Lynch style, keep the quads rolling, keep your feet not planted, but keep those legs churning and just try to work your way towards the end zone. He looked like a power back on that running touchdown. He got really impressive game from Chris Carson on that touchdown, but outside of that, sort of what you'd expect, which was not too many yards picked up, a lot of important runs to pick up 3rd and 1s, but Chris Carson not really lighting the world on fire in his return. But it's good to have him back. It's good to have Carlos Hyde back. No big mistakes from the offensive line who kept the ball in Russ's hands. We didn't see any mental errors that allowed the Eagles front 7, and that Eagles defensive front is probably now the strongest part of that Eagles team. No big mistakes from the line that allowed the Eagles outside linebackers or defensive ends to tee off on Russell Wilson and force the ball out of his hands, something like we saw in the Los Angeles Rams game that caused 2 fumbles and 2 interceptions. I will say the most concerning part of the Seahawks game was Pete's 4th down decisions. Now, we saw the Seahawks were 0 for 2 in the first half going for it on 4th down. Now, both were short yardage situations. One was inside the 10. Pete Carroll clearly wanted the 7 instead of settling for the field goal. The other one was when you were just outside of field goal range around the 40-yard line. If you punt, you're only going to get about 30 yards average on the net punt. So it's not really worth it in that scenario to play the field position game. You try to pick up the sticks to get yourself into at least field goal range, if not scoring a touchdown. I like the aggressiveness, and don't get me wrong, the fact that Pete Carroll went for it on both of these plays was absolutely the right call. The reason that these plays were so concerning is that the Seahawks went 0 for 2 on them. You have so many playmakers between Russell Wilson, Chris Carson, even Carlos Hyde, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, and when Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf attract attention, David Moore can be another playmaker. In both of these plays, that failed on 4th and short, the Seahawks tried to be cute with motions and sweeps and screens. I don't understand it. Both plays got blown up. The Eagles stopped the Seahawks on both of those drives, and the Seahawks had to turn the ball over. Now, this game could have been a blowout had the Seahawks actually been able to convert those possessions for scores. But since they weren't able to convert either of those possessions in the first half, the Eagles were able to keep the game sort of within striking distance. And Pete Carroll said after the game that he agrees and would go for both of those calls again on 4th down. He wouldn't kick the field goal and he wouldn't punt. He'd go for it again, but he has to change up the play calling. And the play calling was extremely poor on both of those plays. You have so many playmakers. Hit them with a power run or hit them with a short pass and just pick up the chains. Don't do a bunch of cute stuff behind the line. I don't like to see the motion on fourth down. I don't like to see a little screen on fourth down. Pick up the sticks, move the chains, keep the drive rolling, and pick up at least 3 points on your drive. The rest of the NFL helped the Seahawks for seeding 2 throughout the NFL. The Cardinals lost to the Patriots on a last-second field goal. Kyler Murray and crew look a little bit average, and they've dropped off since that Seahawks loss. The Niners upset the Rams, which puts the Seahawks back into the driver's seat in the NFC West. It would have been a perfect weekend for the Seahawks if only the Broncos could have beat the Saints. Unfortunately, for the Denver Broncos, all 4 of their quarterbacks were on the COVID-19 list. One of their quarterbacks contracted the virus. The other 3 out due to contact tracing and were deemed high risk and not high risk, but had contact with the quarterback who did have COVID-19, which created a really odd moment in this game. Something you'll never see again, a complete 2020 moment that will never happen in the NFL. Kendall Hinton had to start at quarterback for the Denver Broncos. Kendall Hinton was a wide receiver, a practice squad wide receiver who had never played an NFL game before this. He was apparently a second-string quarterback in college before he switched over to wide receiver, lost the quarterback job at Wake Forest. Now he's on the Denver Broncos practice squad, called up to be quarterback for this game against the New Orleans Saints, who are also starting a tight end at quarterback. Drew Brees is out. The Saints keep Jameis Winston on the bench, decide to start Taysom Hill, who has had a history of throwing the ball and is kind of like a Swiss Army knife for the Saints offense. He can kind of play anywhere, any position, but he is technically regarded as a tight end. So you had a quarterback, you had 2 quarterbacks that weren't actually quarterbacks. You had a wide receiver on one side, you had a tight end on the other side. Unsurprisingly, the Saints dominated the Broncos. Kendall Hinton went 1 for 13 with 2 interceptions. It turns out that normal people can't play quarterback in the NFL. There are some pretty good guys on the other side of the ball playing defense. Unfortunate for the Denver Broncos to be in that scenario. Unfortunate for the Seahawks that the Saints got such a cakewalk victory while Drew Brees is injured. That's the only team that the Seahawks do not control their own destiny against is the Saints. In order for the Seahawks to get that first seed, they would need the Saints to drop at least one of their remaining games. They do have sort of a tough schedule coming up. They still have to play the Falcons. They still have to play the Vikings, who are now hot. They also have to play Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, including Tyreek Hill, who had a crazy, crazy week against the Buccaneers this weekend. All right, that was the second of 3 victories for the Seahawks on Monday. Let's talk about the last of the 3 victories that we saw on Sunday night. The Sounders battled FC Dallas in the second round of the MLS Cup playoffs. This is the only playoff game of the 3 games that we got to cover today on Around the Sound. The Sounders headed to the conference finals with a win, a 1-0 win over FC Dallas. Headed to the conference finals again. It's inevitable. The Sounders have made the Western Conference Finals in 4 of the last 5 years. The 3 previous conference finals, the Sounders have all won and advanced to the MLS Cup, those years being 2016, 17, and 19. But a really tough game for the Sounders here. Dallas putting on pressure, which was really effective against the Sounders trying to build up plays in the final third. Dallas seemed to be cutting the passing lanes for Seattle really well in that game. Lucha Gonzalez and FC Dallas are a good team that really punched above their weight in this game. Seattle were a heavy favorite. Well, not a heavy favorite, but certainly a favorite heading into this game. Dallas had just upset Portland in the last week in Portland, who were the 3 seed. Coming into Seattle, who were the 2 seed, it didn't seem like Dallas would be able to pick themselves up and come out again and look to charge an upset for Seattle. Like I said, Dallas really punching above their weight, had some chances to win that game or at least equalize late on and make it 1-1. An impressive run for Dallas this year, who always seems to be near the top of the Western Conference. Overall, it was just Seattle that was too much for them, and the Sounders found a different way to win the game this time. It took a set-piece goal from center back Shane O'Neill to win it. Ladero on the corner got his 6th straight assist, a 6th straight assist in an MLS playoff game. He now holds the record for straight assists in MLS playoff games, which sounds like a mouth-jumbled stat, but if you actually think about it, is extremely impressive for Nico Ladero. The Seattle Sounders seem built for the postseason. They find different ways to get it done against difficult-to-play teams like Lucha Gonzalez and FC Dallas, who are a very difficult team to kill off. They're a team that always seems to show up in the playoffs and give good teams a run for their money, like they did against Portland last week. Sounders FC have now knocked off Dallas in 2014 in the playoffs, 2016, 2019, and now 2020. It seems to be an annual occurrence for the Sounders at this point to knock Dallas out. The conference final is set for Monday, December 7th. The Sounders will face the winner of Sporting Kansas City and Minnesota United. That should also be a good game. That game's on Thursday, so the Sounders will get a little bit more rest than their opponent that they will face on Monday. If Sporting Kansas City wins that game, the Sounders will be headed to Kansas City to play. If Minnesota wins that game, they will host Minnesota due to being a higher seed. All right, 3 games, 3 wins. We covered them all. That's all we had to get through today on Around the Sound. Stay tuned because on Saturday we've got plenty more to talk about. There are more games coming up this next weekend for UW, the Hawks, and the Sounders. It's an exciting time of the year. It's an exciting calendar time for Seattle sports fans. 2020 has also added to that, meaning that the Huskies are playing games after Black Friday, after what the Apple Cup normally is in a normal calendar year. Still have some of the regular season to go. Stanford this weekend, then that big Oregon game coming up the following weekend. We'll cover all of it. Stay here on Around the Sound. New episodes every Wednesday and Saturday. Stay safe. We'll be back. Thanks for listening.